Yeah, if there appears to be a team that's emerging as a team that is the tonic for whatever ills you at the time, Oklahoma State's becoming that team for Iowa State to put up 348 yards passing, 3 touchdowns. Now, Oklahoma State on the surface, if you just look at the record, 2-2. Well, they beat Central Arkansas and didn't do it impressively by like 2 touchdowns against an FCS team. They went to Arizona State, which, my goodness, they did win the game over Arizona State. It was an extremely ugly game, and then Arizona State turned around and lost to Fresno State 29-0. I don't know
Mhm.
how a team gets shut out in college football these days. And now Iowa State puts up 34. I don't know that Iowa State's seen 34 points against an FBS team in a couple years. And again, Rocco Becht, of course, Taylor Decker suspended for the season. Rocco Becht and dismissed from the program. 27 of 38, 348, 3 touchdowns. So they did most of their work through the air, which is unlike Iowa State with only 74 yards on the ground. So while that's a good sign for them, I don't know if that's some fool's gold. And when they run into Oklahoma's defense, I would expect things to revert to the norm.
Yeah, I would expect that too, Mark. I think I don't know what's going on with Oklahoma State. It's such a strange situation there. Um, but specifically with Iowa State, I watched a good portion of that game against Oklahoma State, and they still struggled to run the ball. I think they ran the ball for less than 100 yards. But to your point, Beck threw for, I think, what was it, 348 through the air. He's only got 897 yards passing on the season, so he's got 600 and some change in the previous 3 games, and then 300 in that one. And I watched how anemic they were offensively against Ohio the previous week, only putting 7 points on the board. So yeah, I agree with you, Mark. I think it'll come. The only thing you have to guard against, I think, this week for Oklahoma is, and they passed this with flying colors earlier on in the year. I thought Tulsa could have been a little bit of a trap game, but this one absolutely is got trap written all over it. Now I think there's some things that are being done that will maybe guard that a little bit. They are, and kids love this. Obviously, um, they have the new Unity uniforms, alternate uniforms that they're breaking out this weekend. It's a big recruiting weekend. They've got David Stone and one of his offensive line teammates that Oklahoma is trying to get in on. Jordan Seaton, one of the top offensive linemen in the country, is coming in for a visit. So they've got a lot of recruiting stuff going on. It's a night game. That always gets the fans maybe a little bit more involved than they would if it was an 11 a.m. game against Iowa State. So I think there's some things there. But when I think about this, Mark, when you think about this from a player's perspective, and obviously they see scores, they watch film. I don't really see how there's any way they're actually fired up to play Iowa State, knowing that Texas is next weekend. So I think you still have to guard against the look ahead a little bit, and I think that's the only thing for me, Mark, that would keep this game within the numbers is the look ahead. Iowa State's defense is probably going to keep them somewhat competitive in this game, at least early on. But I would be surprised if Oklahoma isn't in a position where they're pulling away in the third or fourth quarter, um, just because of how bad Iowa State has been minus 1 game this year offensively. I think they're averaging less than 3 yards a carry for the season. That's even when you include their game 1 against Northern Iowa. Somehow they get, and I'll have to go back and look at this, Mark. I'm trying to remember the score of this game, but somehow they ended up giving up what was it, 20 points? I mean, only 20 points to Iowa earlier on in the season. So yeah, I think this will be a situation where Oklahoma, if they come and they're ready to play and they're interested in the game, they should be able to hit the, I think it's 20. I think the line is still 20, but hit that number this week against Iowa State.
Maybe one motivation would be that Iowa State did win this game for any of the players, and I don't know what that number is, but it's got to be at least half the roster that was around last season for that game. So there is a bit of payback, and not that these players have experienced previous losses to that against Iowa State, but it's been a series that is completely lopsided. But with Matt Campbell doing some good work early in his tenure at Iowa State, of course, they pulled off a couple upsets a few years ago, and then they did again win the game last season by, I believe, 2 scores. I believe it was a 1-score game until extremely late in the game, and then or was it the other way around? Oklahoma won by 2 scores. Now I'm getting mixed up in terms of last year's game.
Yeah, Oklahoma won that game last year. Yeah,
it's like 27 to 14, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Okay, I got that turned around. So there wouldn't be many players who have lost to Iowa State on this team, because you would have to go back to 2020 for that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So forget my motivation. So that's out the door. Yeah.
Well, and I think part of it, Mark, when you look at it, how Oklahoma started in their first home conference game last year against Kansas State, and just really, did not play well in that game. Ended up losing, and that caused kind of a string of losing streak there, 3 games to start conference season with Kansas State, TCU, and Texas, certainly. So I think there's that motivation, right? I think that they really want to be undefeated going into the game against Texas. And Mark, it's something that they haven't. I'm surprised there hasn't been more made of this from the Oklahoma side, but I really haven't heard any of it. You can imagine this was the most for Oklahoma last year. This was the most lopsided loss that they've had in Red River, I think, in the history of the rivalry. So not only losing that, but getting shut out. There's always a lot of motivation for that game, but I'm sure Oklahoma has maybe a little bit more, coming in this year. And so, I know we'll have plenty of time to break that down, but one of the interesting things coming into this game is Oklahoma is the perceived underdog going into that game against Texas, and it hasn't happened very often over the last 10 to 15 years. Oklahoma hasn't been a considerable underdog coming into that game outside of last year. So yeah, I think there's going to be ample motivation for there not to be any sort of a slip up, and still want to be continuing to play at a high level this week as you roll into Dallas next weekend.